Welcome, adventurers of history, to a journey across the fierce, fascinating, and unforgettable Viking Age. For centuries, the Scandinavians of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden sailed forth from their rugged homelands into the unknown. To some, they were ruthless invaders, striking terror with sudden raids on monasteries and towns. To others, they were bold explorers, crossing stormy seas to discover new worlds and settle far beyond their northern fjords. In this documentary, we will travel alongside these legendary men and women, through their myths and sagas, their daring voyages, and their lasting legacy. You will see how Viking longships carried them to the shores of Britain, France, and even distant lands like Russia, Byzantium, and North America. You shall meet kings, shield maidens, farmers, traders, and poets, each shaping a world that still lives in our imagination today. So, whether you admire them as fearless adventurers or fear them as relentless raiders, prepare to witness the age where steel, fire, and belief in the gods of Asgard guided every step. Welcome to the Viking Age, a story of conquest, survival, and discovery. The wind howls over frozen seas. A dragon-headed ship cuts through the waves, carrying warriors whose names would echo in fear and legend. They came from the rugged north where survival meant strength, and courage was life's only currency. These were the Vikings, explorers, raiders, settlers, whose sails turned rivers into highways, and whose axes carved the fate of kingdoms. This is the Viking before the sails of dragon ships cast their shadows across Europe. There was the North itself, a land forged by ice, wind, and restless seas. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, lands of fjords and forests, long winters and brief summers, where survival demanded strength, ingenuity, and courage. Here, families carved their homes from timber, raising sheep, cattle, and crops on narrow strips of land. Life was harsh, but it bred resilience. Every storm taught patience, every mountain demanded endurance, and every fjord whispered of the world beyond the horizon. The sea was not just a barrier, it was the lifeblood of the Norse people. From an early age, children learned to row, to fish, and to read the waves like words in a book. It was here that the Viking spirit was born. The unquenchable desire to explore, to seek fortune, and to carve destiny upon distant shores. But these people were not merely warriors. They were farmers, craftsmen, poets, and storytellers. They honored their gods, feared the long winters, and dreamed of fertile lands across the seas. In this crucible of hardship and imagination, the Viking Age was waiting to be born. This is where the story begins. In the land of ice and fjords, above the stormy skies, and beneath the roots of the world tree, the Vikings believed in a realm alive with gods, giants, and spirits. This was not a distant heaven, but a world woven into every moment of their lives. At the center stood Odin, the All-Father, wise, one-eyed, and endlessly seeking knowledge. He traded his very eye for wisdom and hung upon the sacred tree, pierced by his own spear, to learn the secrets of the runes. By his side were ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, whispering to him the fate of men. Then came Thor, god of thunder, the protector of mankind. With his mighty hammer, Mjolnir, he struck down giants and monsters that threatened the order of the world. His booming laughter and strength were the shield of farmers, sailors, and warriors alike. But the Norse cosmos was not only light, it was also shadow. Loki, the trickster, danced between loyalty and betrayal, his cleverness shaping the fate of gods and men. From Asgard to Midgard, from Jotunheim to Hel, the Vikings saw themselves as part of this grand story, where courage, honor, and fate were written in the stars above and the roots below. in the sagas and in song. These gods were more than myths. They were family protectors, guides in war, and companions in hardship. To be a Viking was to walk with Odin's wisdom, fight with Thor's strength, and beware the cunning of Loki. The gods were never far away. They were everywhere when the sails were furled and the swords sheathed. Most Vikings returned not to battlefields, but to the rhythms of daily life. Though their reputation was forged in fire and steel, the heartbeat of the Viking Age was found in simple farms, quiet workshops, and bustling villages. The majority were farmers, tending to livestock and working narrow strips of soil carved from rugged land. Goats, cattle, and sheep provided milk, meat, and wool, while barley and rye fed families through long winters. Farming was hard, yet it sustained the North. Craftsmen shaped iron into axes, swords, and tools, and carved wood into ships and houses. Every nail, every plank, every piece of jewelry reflected skill passed down through generations. Blacksmiths were highly respected, for they created both the tools of survival and the weapons of glory. Warriors were not always at sea. At home, they trained with sword and shield, strengthening their bodies and testing their courage. To fight was not merely an act of war, but a way of life, rooted in honor and the belief that a glorious death ensured a seat in Valhalla. Together, farmers, craftsmen, and warriors formed the backbone of Viking society. They were not savages living only for conquest. They were people of discipline, community, and purpose. In the longhouses, families gathered around the fire to share meals, tell stories, and dream of the gods' favor. It was here, in the balance between peace and war, that the Viking Age truly lived. In the Viking Age, women stood at the very heart of the household, and sometimes at the edge of the battlefield. While sagas often speak of fierce warriors and daring kings, they also tell of women whose strength guided families, villages, and even kingdom. Most Viking women were homemakers, but do not mistake that role for weakness. They controlled the longhouse, managed the farm in their husband's absence, and safeguarded the family's wealth. A woman's key, often worn on her belt, symbolized her authority over the household. She decided when food was stored, when livestock was sold, and how the family survived through winter's hardships. But there were others, the shield maidens. Clad in mail and carrying spears, these rare yet legendary women fought alongside men. They appear in sagas as defenders of honor, heroines who chose the path of courage. Whether Lagertha, who stood by Ragnar's side, or nameless warriors buried with sword in hand, the idea of the shield maiden burned brightly in Norse imagination. Marriage, too, gave Viking women surprising influence. They could inherit property, demand divorce, and rule in their husband's stead. They were poets, priestesses, and even rulers, as in the case of powerful queens who shaped alliances with wisdom as sharp as any blade. To be a woman of the North was to be both anchor and storm, the steady keeper of the home, and, when fate demanded, the fierce warrior who stood unyielding against the tide. The Viking Age was as much theirs as it was the men's. Well, if the Viking spirit was born on the fjords, it was the longship that gave it wings. Sleek, fast, and deadly, these vessels carried Norsemen to the edges of the known world, striking fear in enemies and awe in allies. The longship was a marvel of engineering. Built from oak, with planks overlapped in the clinker style, it was both flexible and strong, able to bend with the sea rather than break against it. Its shallow keel allowed it to glide through ocean waves, slip up narrow rivers, and even be carried over land. No other ship of its age could rival its versatility. Adorned with dragon-headed prows, these ships were as much symbols of terror as they were tools of exploration. Enemies who saw them approaching knew that flames, steel, and chaos often followed. But for the Vikings, the longship was life itself, a bridge between home and destiny, between farm and conquest. Each crew rowed in rhythm, their oars flashing like the wings of a bird. At sea, the square woolen sail caught the wind, driving the vessel forward with unstoppable speed. Inside, warriors sang chants to keep the pace, while the steersman held the tiller, guiding them toward fortune or doom. With these ships, the Vikings sailed not only to Britain and Francia, but across the Baltic, down Russian rivers, and even across the Atlantic to North America. Wherever the longship went, history changed. It was more than wood and sail. It was the beating heart of the Viking Age. It was the summer of Tibait-Jorsan, when the quiet shores of Lindisfarne would forever be stained with fire and blood. The monastery, a beacon of Christian learning on the coast of Northumbria, knew only peace until the longships came. The monks heard them first, the steady rhythm of oars breaking the waves. Then the dragon prose appeared, cutting through the mist like nightmares made real. To the monks, it must have seemed as though demons had risen from the sea. To the Vikings, Lindisfarne was not a house of God, but a treasure chest waiting to be opened. They came ashore swiftly, steel flashing in the morning light. Doors were smashed, holy relics seized, and gold stripped from altars. Monks, unarmed and unprepared, fell beneath axes and swords. Others were dragged away in chains, destined for slavery in foreign lands. The cries of the helpless mingled with the roar of the sea, and the laughter of warriors who believed Odin had blessed them with plunder. Word of Lindisfarne forceful spread like wildfire across Europe. For Christian chroniclers, it was a day of horror, a punishment from the heavens. For the Vikings, it was triumph, proof that their longships could strike anywhere, that no coast was safe. The Viking Age had begun, and the world would never be the same after Lindisfarne. The floodgates opened. The English coasts, once guarded by little more than prayer, soon faced the relentless fury of Viking sails. From Northumbria to Wessex, longships descended like thunderclouds, their dragon prose striking fear into all who saw them. At first, the raids came swift and brutal. Small bands of warriors struck monasteries and coastal villages, vanishing before local forces could gather. To the Vikings, these were golden opportunities. Churches held silver chalices, jeweled reliquaries, and unarmed monks. To the English, it was a nightmare, holy ground defiled, people slain or enslaved, and settlements left in ashes. But as the years passed, raids grew bolder. Entire fleets swept across the coasts, sometimes wintering in England instead of returning home. Villages inland, once thought safe, were now within reach. The Vikings discovered that rivers were their allies, highways into the very heart of the kingdoms. For the Anglo-Saxon rulers, it was a time of fear and desperate defense. Kings tried to raise armies, but the Vikings struck unpredictably, choosing their battles and vanishing when pressed. This new enemy was unlike any other, not bound by borders, not slowed by seasons, and driven by a hunger for wealth and fame. The English chronicles record these years as a time of fire and mourning. But for the Norse, it was glory, a storm of steel and silver. Each raid was not only survival, but honor, and every fallen foe a step closer to the feasting halls of Valhalla. The Vikings did not only raid for wealth, they struck at the very heart of Europe's soul, the monasteries. To the Norse, these places of prayer were strange and unguarded fortresses overflowing with treasure. To the Christians, they were sacred sanctuaries, never meant to know the sound of steel. When Viking warriors stormed the wooden doors of abbeys, the clash was more than physical. It was spiritual. Odin's chosen against the followers of Christ. The monks, cloaked in simple robes, clutched crosses and whispered prayers, but their gods seemed silent as flames consumed their holy halls. Relics of saints, golden chalices, and illuminated manuscripts, priceless works of faith, were seized or destroyed. To the Vikings, these were riches, proof of victory, and offerings for their gods. To the Christians, it was desecration, a wound upon their faith. Chroniclers of the age wrote of horror, demons from the sea, punishments from God, an apocalypse upon the faithful, yet the Norse saw it differently. They believed their raids were blessed by Odin and Thor, that each monastery burned was a step toward fortune and eternal honor. The clash of worldviews, one seeking salvation, the other seeking glory, shaped the Viking Age. Out of the smoke of burning churches rose a new image of the Northmen. Not just raiders, but heathens, enemies of Christendom. And so the Viking raids became more than battles for silver. They became battles of belief, faith against faith, fire against prayer. In the spring of Barbite's sister Wu, the heart of Francia trembled as a fleet of Viking longships appeared upon the Seine. At their head was the legendary Ragnar, a warrior whose name would echo across ages. With Ebite arcerships and thousands of men, he sailed toward Paris, the jewel of the Frankish kingdom. The people of Paris had never seen such terror. The Seine, once a lifeline of trade, became a highway for invaders. The dragon prows glided past villages, leaving them in ashes, until the black smoke of burning homes filled the horizon. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, rushed to gather his forces, but the sheer scale of the Viking host brought fear to his men. Ragnar and his raiders, stormed the city with ferocity. Churches were looted, homes set aflame, and panic swept through the streets. The defenders fought bravely, but the Vikings were relentless, masters of both siege and terror. The air rang with the clash of swords, the cries of the wounded, and the chants of Norse warriors, invoking Odin's blessing. Unable to drive them back, Charles chose tribute over ruin. To save his capital, he paid the Vikings a massive ransom of lingpounds, of silver and gold. Ragnar accepted the wealth and withdrew, leaving Paris smoldering but standing. For the Franks, it was humiliation. For the Vikings, triumph. The siege of Paris showed all of Europe what the Norsemen could do, not just raid villages, but threaten the very capitals of kingdoms. No city was beyond their reach, no river too sacred, no king too powerful. The age of Viking dominance had arrived. From the icy fjords of the north, the Viking tide surged across Europe. No coast, no river, no kingdom was safe from the dragon-prowed longships. To some, they were a curse sent by God. To others, they were men chasing fortune and fame. Wherever they landed, they left behind a trail of blood and silver. In Ireland, monasteries burned, their bells silenced beneath the clash of axes. The once thriving city of Dublin itself was transformed into a Viking stronghold, a base for further raids. In Francia, towns along the Seine and Loire lay in ruin, their people driven to despair as kings paid ransoms to buy peace. Even the Iberian Peninsula felt the sting of Norse steel as raiders struck Moorish ports and Christian kingdoms alike. But the Vikings sought not only plunder, they sought trade. From riverside markets in Russia to bustling harbors of the Mediterranean, they exchanged furs, slaves, and amber for silks, spices, and silver. Each raid was both destruction and opportunity, chaos for one, prosperity for another. The chronicles of the time speak of terror, villagers fleeing at the sight of sails, churches ringing bells in warning, kings scrambling to defend their realms. Yet for the Norse, every sack of silver, every gold chalice, every captive taken was proof of divine favor. Their gods demanded courage, and Europe provided the reward. The Viking Age was not defined by one raid or one kingdom. It was a storm that swept across an entire continent. A storm fueled by blood and silver, with ruin and legend. Not all Viking journeys began with fire and blood. Along the Baltic Sea, the Norse carved out bustling market towns, places where goods, stories, and cultures collided. Here, the Vikings were not raiders, but traders, turning harbors into gateways of wealth. One of the earliest and greatest was Hedeby, a thriving settlement in present-day Denmark. Its wooden piers stretched into the water, lined with longships heavy with goods from distant shores. Markets overflowed with furs from the north, amber from the Baltic, iron tools, and handmade jewelry. In return, traders brought silver from the Frankish realms, glassware from the Rhineland, and fine textiles from the south. In Sweden, Birka became another hub of commerce, drawing merchants from across Europe and beyond. Here, Viking merchants met Slavs, Franks, and even Arabs, exchanging not only goods but also knowledge. Silver dirhams from the Islamic Caliphate flowed into Viking hands, proof of far-reaching networks that connected the icy north with the deserts of the east. These towns were more than markets. They were cultural crossroads. Languages mingled, alliances formed, and young Vikings learned that fortune could be won not only with the sword, but with the scale and coin. The clang of blacksmiths, the cries of merchants, and the smell of smoked fish and fresh bread filled the air. It was a world alive with energy, a reminder that the Viking Age was as much about trade as it was about conquest. In the Baltic towns, the Vikings revealed another face, that of sailors, merchants, and craftsmen, builders of networks that reached across continents. While some Vikings sailed west to raid England and Francia, others turned east, following the great rivers of Russia toward Byzantium. These men were called Varangians, and their journeys would leave a lasting mark on both Slavic lands and the Byzantine Empire itself. Along the Dnieper and Volga rivers, the Norse built trading routes that connected the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and beyond. They founded settlements that grew into powerful cities, Novgorod and Kiev among them. Here, they mingled with Slavic peoples, sometimes trading peacefully, sometimes conquering by force. Over time, these Viking leaders became known as the Rus, giving their name to the land that would become Russia. But the ultimate prize lay further south, Constantinople, the shining jewel of Byzantium. To reach it, the Varangians braved rapids, forests, and hostile tribes, hauling their ships over land when rivers failed them. The Byzantines, at first wary of these fierce northerners, soon recognized their value. Many Varangians took service in the emperor's elite bodyguard, the Varangian Guard, clad in mail, wielding massive axes. They became famous for their loyalty and fearlessness, standing as the last line of defense for the emperor himself. To the Rus, the rivers were lifelines of silver and trade. To Byzantium, the Varangians were both threat and shield. In this blending of cultures, the Vikings proved once more their greatest strength, the ability to adapt, to conquer, and to carve their names into the histories of distant lands. Though remembered as raiders, the Vikings were also part of one of the greatest trade networks the world has ever known, the Silk Road. From the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the deserts of Arabia and the markets of Persia, Norse traders carried goods, stories, and silver across continents. The journey began with furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves taken from raids or bought in markets. These were carried along rivers through the Rus's lands and exchanged for silver coins, minted in the Islamic Caliphate. The most prized were the silver dirhams, thousands of which have been unearthed in Viking graves, proof of the scale of their trade. Through these routes, Vikings obtained silk from China, spices from India, and glassware from the Middle East. They brought these luxuries back to Scandinavia, where silk was stitched into garments for chieftains and silver was melted into bracelets and arm rings. Each coin, each fabric, each gem told a story of distant lands. The Vikings were not isolated raiders on the edge of Europe. They were global traders, bridging east and west. In markets from Hedeby to Baghdad, their presence was felt. Their longships carried them not only to conquest, but into the beating heart of the world's economy. The sagas speak of warriors and gods, but the graves of merchants speak of silk and silver. In both blood and trade, the Vikings carved their place in history. Warriors with swords, but also with scales and coin. For a people born of the sea, the horizon was never a limit. It was a promise. As Europe trembled under Viking raids, other Norsemen turned westward, braving the unknown waters of the North Atlantic. Their voyages would carry them further than any Europeans before them, into lands of fire, ice, and endless opportunity. The first great leap was to Iceland. Harsh yet fertile, it became a haven for settlers fleeing crowded lands and rival chieftains. Here, longhouses rose among volcanic plains, and communities flourished under new laws and assemblies. The famous Althing, one of the world's earliest parliaments. From Iceland, the horizon stretched further still to Greenland. Led by Eric the Red, exiled for murder, settlers carved out farms along its frozen coast. Life was brutal, winters long, harvests short, seas treacherous. Yet they endured, sustained by trade and stubborn will. Greenland became a stepping stone for even greater journeys. For beyond Greenland lay whispers of another land. Vast forests, rich soil, wild grapes. A place they would call Vinland. Though few would see it, and fewer still would settle there, the Vikings had crossed the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. The daring of these voyages was not born of chance, but of necessity and spirit. In their longships, guided by stars, sun, and instinct, the Norse pushed beyond the edge of maps. Each wave carried them further into legend, proving that to a Viking, no ocean was too wide, no land too distant, no horizon too final. Beyond Greenland lay whispers of a rich and fertile land, a place of wild grapes, towering forests, and untamed beauty. Around the year Itsen, Viking explorers set sail into the unknown and became the first Europeans to reach North America. They called it Vinland, the land of wine. The journey was led by Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red. With courage and skill, he guided his longship west across cold seas until the coastline of a new world rose before his crew. To the Norse, this land was a marvel, rivers teeming with fish, endless forests for timber, soil far richer than the rocky earth of Greenland. For settlers weary of harsh winters, Vinland seemed a gift from the gods. The Vikings built small settlements with turf houses and workshops and explored the strange land. But Vinland was not empty. Native peoples, the Skrælings, as the Norse called them, soon appeared. At first there was cautious trade, red cloth exchanged for pelts. Yet fear and mistrust grew, and clashes broke out. The Vikings, though fierce, were far from home, and the land was not easily tamed. After a few short years, the settlements were abandoned. The dangers outweighed the promise, and the Norse returned to Greenland and Iceland. Yet the memory of Vinland lived on in sagas, whispered for generations, until rediscovered centuries later. The voyage to Vinland proved the daring of the Viking spirit. They had crossed an ocean and touched another continent. Long before others, they had seen the lands beyond the western horizon. As Viking raids grew bolder, so too did the ambitions of their leaders. In Denmark, warlords transformed into kings, forging powerful realms that stretched beyond their homeland. The rise of the Danish kings marked the shift from scattered raiders to organized rulers of empires. Early Danish rulers like King Gudfred strengthened their power by uniting clans under one banner. He fortified trade centers such as Hedeby, ensuring wealth flowed into Denmark's heart. His reign showed that Viking strength was not only in raiding, but in control of commerce and land. The kings expanded their reach further. King Gorm the Old laid the foundation of a lasting dynasty, remembered as the first recognized king of Denmark. His son, Harald Bluetooth, went further still, uniting Denmark and Norway, raising the great gelling stones to proclaim his achievements, and embracing Christianity, which brought both political advantage and lasting legacy. Through these rulers, the Danish kingdom became a true power. No longer were the Vikings only bands of raiders striking Europe's coasts. They were now kings commanding armies, building fortresses, and shaping nations. With fleets of longships and disciplined warriors, Danish kings brought England, Norway, and parts of the Baltic into their sphere of influence. The rise of the Danish crown symbolized a transformation of the Viking Age, from fleeting raids to enduring rule. The kings of Denmark were not just raiders with crowns. They were architects of kingdoms that would outlast the age of the Vikings itself. In the rugged mountains and deep fjords of Norway, countless small chieftains once ruled, each commanding warriors and villages in their valleys. Power was scattered, loyalty divided, and rivalries often erupted in bloodshed. But in the late 10th century, one man rose above them all: Harald Fairhair, remembered as the first king to unite Norway. The sagas tell that Harald, struck by love for a proud maiden, vowed not to cut or comb his hair until he had made all of Norway his own. For 10 years, his hair grew wild as he gathered allies, built fleets, and crushed rivals. Battle by battle, fjord by fjord, he extended his rule, defeating powerful chieftains who resisted his ambition. His greatest test came at the Battle of Hafrsfjord, where Harald's fleet clashed with a coalition of rival lords. The sea churned red with blood, shields splintered, and longships rammed one another in a brutal fight. At last, Harald triumphed, his enemies slain or driven into exile. With Hafrsfjord won, Norway bowed to one king. Harald then combed and cut his hair, earning his name, Fairhair. His reign marked the birth of a united Norway, though not without consequence. Many chieftains fled overseas, unwilling to live under his rule, fueling new waves of Viking expansion across the seas. Harald Fairhair's legacy was more than conquest. He turned a land of divided warlords into a kingdom, planting the roots of a nation that would endure long after the Viking Age. While the Danes struck west into England and the Norwegians sailed into the Atlantic, the Swedes turned east, their eyes fixed on the rivers that cut deep into the heart of Europe and Asia. Known as the Sphere, these Vikings became explorers, traders, and conquerors across vast eastern lands. From their homeland around Lake Mälaren, Swedish longships pushed into the Baltic Sea. Crossing to the shores of present-day Finland, Estonia, and Latvia, they established trade routes and outposts, blending with local tribes. But their ambition did not end there. They followed the great rivers south, the Neva, the Dnieper, and the Volga, until they reached the glittering markets of Byzantium and the Islamic world. The Swedes became known as the Rus, rulers of fortified towns like Novgorod and Kiev. They were feared as raiders, but also respected as traders and kings. Their ships carried furs, slaves, and honey downriver, returning with silver, silks, and weapons of fine steel. Through marriage and conquest, they intertwined with Slavic peoples, creating the foundations of what would one day become Russia. Swedish warriors also became the backbone of the famed Varangian Guard. In Constantinople, wielding axes in defense of the Byzantine emperors. In these distant lands, far from the fjords of Scandinavia, the Swedes left a mark that stretched from the forests of the Baltic to the palaces of Byzantium. The eastern expansion was proof of Viking adaptability. The Swedes may not have carved their name into England's kingdoms, but they built a bridge between Scandinavia and the vast wealth of the East, leaving a legacy of power and trade that shaped the medieval world. By the late Jute century, Viking raids on England had become more than lightning strikes. Entire armies landed, seeking not only silver, but land to claim as their own. This vast Norse territory, stretching across northern and eastern England, became known as the Danelaw. It was here that Viking ambition clashed with one of England's greatest kings, Alfred the Great of Wessex. The Great Heathen Army, a coalition of Viking warbands, swept across England. Northumbria and East Anglia fell quickly. York was taken and renamed Jorvik, becoming a thriving Viking city. From these strongholds, the Norse carved out law and order in their own fashion, ruling towns and farms under Scandinavian customs, language, and beliefs. Yet in Wessex, resistance burned. Alfred, king of the West Saxons, fought battle after battle against the invaders. Defeat forced him into exile, hiding in marshlands. But he did not yield. From the swamps of Athelney, Alfred rebuilt his strength, forging a new army and navy to resist the Norse tide. The turning point came at the Battle of Edington in Barbite Chishabat. Ulfrid's forces crushed the Viking army led by Guthrum, forcing him to accept baptism and retreat east. Though the Danelaw endured, Alfred secured the survival of Wessex, the seed of a future united England. The clash between Alfred and the Vikings was more than war. It was a struggle of cultures, Norse law against Saxon law, pagan gods against Christianity, raiders against kings. Out of this crucible, England was forged, tempered by Viking steel and Alfred's resolve. As Viking raids battered the coasts of Francia, the Frankish kings grew weary of endless war. Villages burned, rivers ran red, and cities paid tribute to buy peace. But in the early 4th century, one Viking chieftain found not just plunder, but a permanent home. His name was Rollo, and his legacy would be the birth of Normandy. Rollo was a towering figure, said to be so large that no horse could bear him. Leading his warbands, he struck deep into the heart of Francia, seizing Rouen and terrorizing the Seine Valley. His fleets raided Paris and beyond, forcing the Franks into a choice, endless war or negotiation. In Jules Caesar, King Charles the Simple made a bold decision. At the Treaty of St. Clair sur Epte, he granted Rollo and his men land along the lower Seine. In exchange, the Vikings swore loyalty to the Frankish crown, converted to Christianity, and promised to defend the realm against other raiders. Thus was born Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Rollo and his followers settled, intermarried with the local population, and blended Norse and Frankish culture. Viking longhouses gave way to stone castles, and pagan gods were replaced by Christian churches. Yet the spirit of the Northmen endured. Fierce warriors, skilled sailors, and ambitious rulers. From Rollo's line would come a dynasty that changed history, the Dukes of Normandy. And in Itenling-le-Chaloup, his descendant, William the Conqueror, would carry the Viking legacy across the sea once more. This time, to conquering, the Viking world was bound not only by sword and sail, but by faith. Before the cross of Christ spread across the north, the Norse worshipped their gods through rituals of power, prayer, and sacrifice. To honor Odin, Thor, and Frey, they turned forests, lakes, and sacred groves into temples beneath the sky. In great feasts called blots, animals were sacrificed to win the gods' favor. Bulls, goats, and horses were led to wooden altars, their blood collected in bowls and sprinkled upon statues, walls, and worshippers. The people feasted on roasted meat, believing they shared their strength with the divine. But the sagas and chronicles also speak of darker rites. At Uppsala in Sweden, it was said that every 9 years, 9 of every kind of creature, including humans, were sacrificed to the gods. Their bodies were hung in sacred groves, their spirits sent as offerings. Whether myth or truth, such stories painted the Vikings as both pious and fearsome. Rituals were not only about blood, they were about connection to ancestors, to nature, and to fate. Fires burned in honor of Thor, prayers were whispered before voyages, and charms carved in runes were offered for protection. To the Norse, sacrifice was not cruelty. It was exchange. Give to the gods, and they would give in return. Though Christianity would later condemn these practices, they reveal the depth of Viking belief. A world where gods walked close, fate was unyielding, and life and death were part of the same sacred circle. For in the Viking Age, not all wisdom came from warriors and kings. Some knowledge lay in the hands of those who walked between worlds. The Völelva, the Reconist, of seeresses gifted with the power of prophecy. Their voices carried the whispers of the Norns, the weavers of fate, and their words could shape the path of warriors and rulers alike. The Völelva were respected and feared. Dressed in long cloaks, with staffs carved in runes, they traveled from settlement to settlement, called upon during time. Villages gathered around fires as the seeress entered trance, chanting and weaving spells. With herbs, drums, and song, she slipped into visions of what was yet to come. Her prophecies were not always of triumph. Often, she spoke of loss, betrayal, or doom. In the sagas, Völelvas foretold battles, the rise and fall of kings, even the final destruction of the gods at Ragnarök. To ignore her words was to risk angering fate itself. But the Völelva was not only a prophet of war, she was also a guide, blessing voyages, protecting harvests, and invoking the gods for safe childbirth. In her hands, magic and mystery lived side by side with daily life. Though Christianity would later denounce them as witches, the Völelva's role reminds us that the Vikings lived in a world where the future was never certain, but always foretold. The seeress stood as a bridge between the seen and the unseen, her voice carrying the weight of destiny before paper and ink, before parchment filled with Latin words. The Norse carried their history in 2 forms, runes carved in stone and stories spoken aloud. Together, they preserve the wisdom, myths, and deeds of the Viking Age. The runic alphabet, known as the Elder Futhark and later the Younger Futhark, was more than writing. Each symbol carried sound, meaning, and power. Carved into wood, bone, or stone, runes marked graves, recorded victories, and blessed weapons. Warriors etched runes into their swords for strength, while merchants scratched them into amulets for luck in trade. Runestones, towering slabs carved with intricate designs, stood across Scandinavia. Some told of voyages across seas, others honored fallen warriors, and many proclaimed the lineage of kings. They were monuments to memory, ensuring that names would not be forgotten. Yet the Vikings' greatest legacy lived not in stone, but in storytelling. Around the fire in longhouses, skalds, poets and bards recited sagas of gods and heroes. They told of Odin's wisdom, Thor's battles, and the tragic fates of men. Each story was more than entertainment. It carried lessons of courage, loyalty, and fate. In an age without books, memory was everything, and words were weapons as sharp as any sword. Together, runes and stories bound Viking culture. One gave permanence to names and deeds. The other gave life to myths and dreams. In their symbols and sagas, the Vikings ensured that their voices would echo long after their ships stopped sailing. For the Vikings, fate was inescapable, even for the gods. At the end of all things lay Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, when the world itself would be consumed by fire and reborn anew. The seeress told of signs that would come: the endless winter, the sun swallowed by wolves, the earth trembling as giants broke free. Brothers would turn on brothers, fathers on sons, and all bonds of kinship would be shattered. The Midgard serpent would rise from the sea, spewing poison across the land, while the wolf Fenrir would break his chains and devour all in his path. At Ragnarok, the gods themselves would march to battle. Odin, clad in armor, would face Fenrir and fall beneath the monster's jaws. Thor would strike down the serpent Jormungandr, but after walking 9 steps, he too would collapse, dead from its venom. Loki, the trickster, would stand with the giants, leading chaos against the order of Asgard. Fire would consume the world as Surt, the fire giant, swept his flaming sword across the sky. Mountains would crumble, seas would boil, and all creation would sink into darkness. Yet Ragnarok was not only an end, it was a beginning. From the ashes, the earth would rise again, green and fertile. Survivors would walk the land, and Baldr, the beloved god, would return. A new world would be born, brighter than the old. For the Vikings, Ragnarok was both dread and hope. It reminded them that life was fleeting, glory eternal, and that even in death, something great awaited beyond the final twilight. For centuries, the Vikings raised horns to Odin, sacrificed to Thor, and whispered to the Norns. But by the 10th and 20th centuries, a new faith spread across the North: Christianity. It arrived not by sword alone, but by kings, missionaries, and the slow turning of hearts. The earliest encounters came during raids, when Viking warriors seized Christian relics from monasteries. At first, these crosses and chalices were seen only as treasure, but as Norsemen settled abroad, in England, Ireland, and Normandy, they lived among Christian peoples, and some took the faith of their neighbors. The true change came when kings embraced the cross. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark proclaimed, through the Jelling stones, that he had made the Danes Christian. In Norway, Olaf Tryggvason, and later Olaf Haraldsson Saint. Olaf spread the faith with both persuasion and force, toppling idols and building churches. In Iceland, the decision came at the Althing around the year Ichen, when leaders chose peace by adopting Christianity while still allowing old rites in private. Conversion was not simple. Pagan rituals and Christian mass often existed side by side for generations. Farmers carved crosses next to runes, and sagas blended Christ with echoes of Odin. Some resisted fiercely, clinging to the old gods, while others saw Christianity as a path to unity, trade, and power in the wider world. By the dawn of the Shoe Earth century, Scandinavia had changed. Wooden temples were replaced by stone churches, and Christ reigned where Odin once ruled. Yet beneath the steeples and the prayers, the memory of the old ways never vanished. It lived on in sagas, in symbols, and in the spirit of the people. The Vikings carved their destiny not only with courage, but with steel. Their weapons were more than tools of war. They were symbols of honor, wealth, and faith. To hold a sword or axe was to hold a piece of a warrior's soul. The axe was the most common weapon. Farmers carried them for chopping wood, but in battle, a simple tool became a deadly blade. The mighty Dane axe, with its long shaft and wide blade, could split shields and helmets in a single stroke. It was the mark of elite warriors, often wielded with terrifying skill. The sword, rarer and more precious, was the treasure of the rich. Forged of layered steel, it gleamed with deadly beauty. Each was given a name, like Ulfbert, blades so fine they were famed across Europe. To own a sword was to carry status, to lose one was shame. Warriors passed them down through generations, treating them as sacred heirlooms. The shield was both defense and identity. Round, painted in bold colors or marked with runes, it protected warriors in the fury of combat. In the famous shield wall, men locked their shields together, becoming a wall of wood and iron that advanced like a living beast. Behind it, courage was tested, and lives were won or lost. Spears, bows, and sieges added to the Viking arsenal, but it was the axe, sword, and shield that defined them. These weapons were not just for killing, they were companions, blessings, and burdens. In life, they won glory. In death, they were buried beside their masters, ready for the halls of Valhalla. The strength of the Vikings was not only in their weapons, but in how they used them. From the rivers of Francia to the fields of England, and Tinti their strategies turned small bands of raiders into armies that toppled kingdoms. The Norse fought not with blind fury, but with cunning, surprise, and discipline. The most feared tactic was the raid itself. Striking without warning, Vikings launched from longships with terrifying speed. Villages woke to the sound of horns and the crash of axes. Too late to mount a defense. By the time reinforcements gathered, the raiders had vanished back to sea, carrying silver, livestock, and captives. In open battle, the Vikings relied on the shield wall. Warriors locked their round shields into a barrier, spears thrusting between gaps, axes waiting to strike. The wall moved as one, grinding forward like a living beast. To break it was nearly impossible. Unless the warriors themselves faltered, they also used fear as a weapon. Horns blared, war cries rose, and berserkers, warriors said to fight in a trance of rage, charged bare-chested, howling like beasts. To their enemies, these men seemed more than human, a storm of fury that shattered courage before steel ever struck. Flexibility was their greatest strength. Longships allowed them to strike anywhere, coasts, rivers, even inland towns. In battle, they adapted quickly, using ambushes, feigned retreats, and sudden flanking attacks. They did not fight by the rigid rules of kings and armies. They fought by the laws of survival and victory. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were tacticians. Their terror lay not only in the blade, but in the mind, where fear often killed long before the sword. The sagas of the North are filled with names that echo like thunder. Warriors whose deeds became legend, whose courage outlived their mortal lives. Among them, few shine brighter than Ragnar Lothbrok, his son Bjorn Ironside, and the shield maiden Lagertha. Ragnar was a chieftain, a raider, and a king of myth. His story tells of a man who donned a cloak of fur made from wolf and bear, Pew and Grest, earning the name Lothbrok, hairy breeches. He raided France and England, daring to strike where few would venture. His end was as legendary as his life. Captured by King Ola of Northumbria, he was thrown into a pit of serpents, meeting death with defiance. His last words foretold the vengeance of his sons, and his prophecy lived true. Among those sons was Bjorn Ironside, famed for his strength and unbreakable will. The sagas say no blade could wound him, his skin as strong as iron. He led raids deep into the Mediterranean, plundering Spain and Italy. His name feared far beyond the northern seas. His legacy stretched far, cementing the Norse as conquerors without bounds. And then there was Lagertha, a warrior woman who fought with shield and spear beside Ragnar. The chronicles speak of her bravery, leading warriors into battle with ferocity unmatched. Though some debate her existence, the saga of Lagertha gave voice to the idea that women, too, could be warriors of renown. Together, Ragnar, Bjorn, and Lagertha stand as symbols of the Viking spirit, bold, unyielding, and destined for legend. Whether in truth or in saga, their names still carry the echo of axe and shield. Though the Vikings are remembered as raiders and warriors, their society was not ruled by chaos. Behind the clang of swords stood a system of law and justice that bound their world together. For the Norse, honor and order mattered as much as courage in battle. At the heart of Viking justice was the Thing, an assembly where free men gathered to settle disputes, laws, and choose leaders. Held in open fields or sacred sites, the Thing was both court and parliament. Here, warriors set aside their axes to argue with words. Every man's voice carried weight, though chieftains and law speakers guided the debates. Disputes often centered on land, inheritance, or blood feuds. If one man killed another, his family could demand vengeance, or compensation known as wergild, a payment in silver or goods to settle the wrong. Refusal to pay often reignited feuds, but acceptance restored peace and honor. The law speaker was the guardian of memory, reciting laws aloud before the assembly, for in a time without books, the law lived in human voices. His role was sacred, ensuring that traditions endured from generation to generation. Punishments varied: fines, exile, or in rare cases, execution. Outlaws, men cast from society, were stripped of all rights, free for anyone to kill. To be outlawed was worse than death, for it meant losing kinship, honor, and belonging. Through law, the Vikings proved they were more than savages. They were builders of order, balancing freedom with responsibility. In the Thing's circle, justice was not written on parchment, but spoken beneath the sky, binding their world together with honor and silver. Long after warriors fell and ships sank, it was words that carried the Viking spirit forward. In smoky longhouses and around roaring fires, poets and storytellers gave voice to the gods, the heroes, and the dead. The Vikings lived not only by the axe and sword, but also by the power of poetry and saga. The skalds, Viking poets, held a special place in society. They were keepers of memory, weaving verse in intricate meters known as drotkave, teat. Their words praised kings, mocked enemies, and preserved deeds for eternity. To be honored in a skald's poem was to achieve immortality. To be mocked was to suffer shame that outlived the grave. These poems praised not only men, but also gods. They told of Odin's wisdom, Thor's thunder, and Freyja's beauty. Through kennings, poetic metaphors, swords became serpents of battle, ships steeds of the sea. Each verse was a puzzle of meaning, rich with imagery and wit. Over generations, these stories grew into great sagas. Written down in Iceland centuries later, they told of Ragnar and his sons, of journeys across oceans, and of love and betrayal. The sagas blended fact and legend, showing Vikings not as faceless raiders, but as people, flawed, passionate, ambitious, and bound by fate. To the Vikings, poetry was not luxury but necessity. Words preserved honor, carried law, and bound communities together. In an age of steel and storm, the sagas became their eternal voice, ensuring that though their ships may sink, Their stories would never drown, though Alfred the Great had beaten back the Viking tide. The struggle for England was far from over. For generations, the Anglo-Saxons fought to reclaim their land from Norse rule, resisting the Danelaw while facing new waves of raiders. From Alfred's heirs to King Othelred, the battle for England was written in fire, silver, and blood. Alfred's son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Othelflede, Lady of the Mercians, pushed back against the Danelaw with determination. They built burhs, fortified towns, to resist Viking attacks and slowly reclaimed territory from Norse control. Ethelflede herself led armies into battle, proving that even in a world of kings, a woman could be a commander of warriors. Yet the raids did not cease. Great fleets returned from Denmark, striking the English coast with renewed fury. By the late 12th century, under King Othelred II, known to history as the Unready, the pressure was relentless. Villages burned, tribute was demanded, and England was bled of silver through payments known as the Danegeld, vast sums meant to buy peace. Though peace never. The chronicles describe fear and despair, churches looted, towns destroyed, families enslaved, yet resistance never died. The English kings raised armies again and again, forging alliances and holding their ground, even as the cost grew unbearable. This long struggle between Saxon and Norse would not end until the arrival of new conquerors, but the resistance of Alfred's heirs kept England alive. A kingdom battered but unbroken from raiders and warlords rose a king who would rule not only Denmark, but also England, Norway, and parts of Sweden. His name was Canute the Great, and he forged a North Sea empire unlike anything before. A Viking who became an emperor, born the son of King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark. Canute sailed to England in Ichenling with an army at his back. The land was weary of Othelred's weakness, and soon the Saxons bent beneath his strength. In Ichenling, after the death of King Edmund Ironside, Canute was crowned King of England. No longer a raider, he was now a ruler of one of Europe's richest kingdoms. Canute ruled with both steel and wisdom. He married Emma of Normandy, widow of Othelred, securing legitimacy and alliances. He kept peace by balancing Saxon nobles and Viking jarls, rewarding loyalty with land and silver. He strengthened the church, building monasteries and honoring both Christian faith and Old Norse traditions. Unlike many conquerors, Canute was accepted not just as a foreign invader, but as a king. From England to Denmark, from Norway to the Baltic, his empire tied the North Sea together in a web of power and trade. Silver flowed, fleets patrolled, and for a brief moment, the Viking dream of a great northern empire was real. Legions later told of Canute's humility, how he sat before the rising tide and commanded the waves to halt, showing his courtiers that no king, however mighty, could command the sea. It was a lesson in power, reminding all that even emperors bowed before forces greater than themselves. With Canute, the Viking Age reached its peak, not as raiders, but as rulers of empires. For nearly 3 centuries, the thunder of Viking longships echoed across Europe. But by the 7th century, the storm began to fade. The era of sudden raids and burning monasteries slowly gave way to kingdoms, trade, and new faith. The Viking Age was ending. Several forces brought the raids to a close. Christianity spread across Scandinavia, reshaping the culture. Where once warriors raised horns to Odin, now churches stood in villages, and priests preached peace. The old gods still lingered, but the cross changed the north forever. Stronger kingdoms also rose in Europe. England, Francia, and others had learned from centuries of terror. Fortified towns, standing armies, and navies made it harder for raiders to strike and escape. Where monks once fled helplessly, soldiers now waited behind stone walls with steel in hand. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia itself, new kings sought stability over chaos. Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish rulers turned their energies toward ruling and uniting their lands. Warriors who once sought plunder across the sea were now bound to their kings, building roads, farms, and fortresses instead of burning foreign shores. Trade replaced raiding. Silver and goods flowed more profitably through markets than through bloodshed. The same longships that once carried fire now carried silk, furs, and wine. The Viking warrior was becoming the Viking farmer, merchant, and king. The 7th century did not erase the Vikings overnight. Raids continued here and there, and warriors still sought glory abroad. But the age of terror was fading. The sails that once darkened horizons now brought peace and prosperity. The Viking Age had reached its twilight on a September morning in Ichenling-Løsseloop. The last great Viking army stood on English soil. Led by King Harald Hardrada of Norway, the warriors had come to claim the English throne. But at Stamford Bridge, fate brought the Viking Age to a fiery close. Hardrada was a man of legend, tall, fierce, and battle. Hardened from campaigns across Europe and the East. With him came thousands of warriors, joined by the treacherous Tostig Godwinson, brother to England's king. Their longships had carried them swiftly across the sea, and early victories seemed to promise success. But King Harold Godwinson of England marched his army with astonishing speed, covering hundreds of miles in days. The Vikings, caught unprepared, were spread across the fields near Stamford Bridge, many without armor, in the unexpected heat of the day. The clash was brutal. English shield walls slammed against Norse lines, spears piercing, axes biting. A lone Viking warrior, legend says, held the bridge alone, cutting down dozens until arrows brought him down. Harald Hardrada fought fiercely, but an arrow struck his throat, ending his life. Leaderless, the Viking army broke. Of the great fleet that crossed, only a fraction returned. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was both triumph and tragedy. For England, it was a desperate victory. For the Norse, it was the twilight of their age. Later, Harold himself would fall at Hastings to the Normans, descendants of Vikings, but the great invasions from the north were over. With Hardrada's death, the Viking Age ended in fire and blood upon an English field. After centuries of raids, conquests, and far-flung voyages, the Viking world changed. The longships still sailed, but not for plunder. The sword was still sharp, but it now defended farms and kingdoms. By the end of the 7th century, the Vikings were no longer raiders of Europe. They were rulers and farmers of the north. The transformation had been building for generations. Chieftains had become kings in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, binding their lands into nations. Great warriors like Harold Fairhair and Canute the Great laid the foundations of monarchies that would endure long after the Viking Age itself ended. The Norse were no longer outsiders, but players in the wider politics of medieval Europe. At home, life returned to the soil. Farmers tilled their fields, raising cattle and crops to feed growing populations. The axe that once split helmets now chopped wood. The ships that once carried raiders now carried merchants. Towns grew into cities. Trade replaced raiding, and wealth was measured not only in silver but in land and alliances. Christianity also reshaped daily life. Stone churches rose where wooden temples once stood, bells replacing the drumbeat of war. Yet echoes of the old gods lingered in sagas, festivals, and the names carved into runestones. The Viking spirit did not vanish. It adapted. Thus the Norse became kings and farmers, merchants and settlers. The age of terror gave way to the age of legacy. Though the dragon prose no longer darkened the seas, the spirit of adventure, endurance, and strength remained in the lands they had once ruled with fire and steel. Though their raids left scars across Europe, the Vikings also left a quieter legacy, one written not in steel or stone, but in words. From England to Russia, Norse speech blended with local tongues, reshaping languages for centuries to come. In England, Viking settlers in the Danelaw lived beside Anglo-Saxons, and their Old Norse mixed with Old English. Everyday words we still use today, sky, egg, knife, husband, window, law, came from the Vikings. Even simple words like they, their, them are Norse gifts, proving how deeply their tongue shaped English speech. In Scotland and Ireland, Norse names marked the land itself. Islands like Orkney and Dublin carry echoes of their language. Across the seas, Norse words joined Gaelic, leaving behind traces still spoken in dialects today. Further east, the Russes carried Old Norse into Slavic lands. While Russian evolved into its own branch, Norse influence lived on in names, trade words, and even in the name Russia itself, derived from the Rus, the Norse rulers of early Slavic kingdoms. Runes also carried language into stone. Carved into monuments, weapons, and charms, they preserved both names and ideas, blending art with memory. Even after conversion to Christianity, many continued to inscribe in runes alongside Latin letters, proof of their lasting power. Language was as much a weapon as a sword, and as enduring as any stone fortress. Through it, the Vikings left their mark not only on battlefields, but in the very words people spoke. Words that we still use, often without knowing, each time we raise our eyes to the sky, open a window, or tell a tale of law and war. Though the Viking Age ended nearly 1,000 years ago, its impact on Europe was permanent. From the shores of England to the palaces of Byzantium, the Norse left behind more than fire and fear. They reshaped kingdoms, trade, and culture itself. In England, Viking settlers transformed society. The Danelaw introduced Norse law, language, and farming methods. Cities like York, once Roman ruins, became thriving Viking centers of trade. Centuries later, William the Conqueror, a descendant of Rollo the Viking, would forever change England after the Battle of Hastings in Lichen-Ling-Loche-Lope. In France, the Duchy of Normandy emerged from Viking settlement. The Normans blended Norse vigor with Frankish culture, creating one of Europe's strongest powers. From Normandy, their influence spread not only to England, but to Italy and the Crusader states. In the east, Swedish Vikings shaped the birth of Russia. The Russes founded cities like Novgorod and Kiev, blending Norse and Slavic traditions. Their trade routes stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, connecting Europe with the riches of Byzantium and the Islamic world. Even the Byzantine Empire felt their presence. The Varangian Guard, composed of fierce Norse warriors, stood as the emperor's personal bodyguard, wielding axes in defense of Constantinople. To Byzantines, they were both foreigners and indispensable protectors. The Vikings also expanded Europe's horizons. They sailed to Iceland, Greenland, and North America, proving that the continent's reach extended far beyond its old borders. Their daring voyages inspired future generations of explorers who carried Europe into new worlds. Thus, the Vikings were not just raiders, but architects of Europe's transformation. They left kingdoms, languages, and legacies, that shaped the Middle Ages and echo even into the modern world. Though the longships have rotted and the war cries faded, the earth still remembers the Vikings. Across Scandinavia and beyond, archaeology has unearthed the silent witnesses of their age, weapons, ships, jewelry, and bones that tell the story of a people both fierce and complex. In burial mounds, Viking warriors were laid to rest with swords, shields, and treasures. Some graves contained women buried with weapons, suggesting that the sagas of shield maidens were not only myth. Others revealed merchants interred with scales and coins, proof that trade was as honored as battle. The most breathtaking finds are the ships. At Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, whole vessels were buried with their owners, preserved beneath the soil for over 1,000 years, carved with dragon heads and lined with grave goods. These ships remind us that, to a Viking, the journey after death was as important as life itself. Everyday objects speak just as loudly. Amber beads, iron tools, wooden combs, and fragments of clothing reveal lives of farmers and families, not only warriors. Runestones still stand in fields, carved with names and deeds, voices echoing across the centuries. Outside Scandinavia, Viking traces are found in York, Dublin, Kiev, and even Greenland. Archaeologists uncover longhouses, fortresses, and marketplaces, each stone and shard of pottery whispering of the people who once lived there. And, for centuries, the word Viking conjured images of wild barbarians, horned helmets, bloodlust, and endless slaughter. But how much of this was truth, and how much was myth? Archaeology and sagas reveal a people far more complex than the monsters painted in medieval chronicles. The horned helmet is perhaps the greatest myth. No Viking ever wore one in battle. It was a fantasy born in later centuries, popularized in operas and artwork. Real Viking helmets were simple iron or leather built for protection, not spectacle. Were they savages, then? Christian monks who recorded the raids certainly thought so. To them, the Vikings were heathens, demons sent to punish the faithful. Their chronicles describe bloodshed and fire, and they were not wrong, for the Vikings could be brutal in war. Monasteries burned, captives were taken, and silver was stolen at sword point. But the Vikings were also farmers, traders, and craftsmen. They built towns, forged alliances, and sailed not only to plunder, but to explore and trade. Women had rights unknown in much of medieval Europe, to divorce, to own property, even to wield weapons. They valued law and assemblies, and their sagas show deep respect for honor, justice, and poetry. In truth, the Vikings were both warriors who could be merciless, but also builders of kingdoms, traders of goods, and dreamers of stories. To call them only barbarians is to ignore their ships, their laws, their art, and their legacy. They were not monsters nor saints, but humans, fierce, ambitious, flawed, and enduring. Though the Viking Age ended nearly 1,000 years ago, its legacy still lives with us. In our languages, in our laws, in our ships and stories, the Northmen remain part of our world. In England, many towns still bear Viking names: York, Grimsby, Derby. In our speech, we use Norse words every day: sky, law, husband, window. The voices of the Vikings echo whenever we speak of the sea or the storms above. Their impact on kingdoms was lasting. The Normans, descendants of Rollo, reshaped England and Europe after Ichenling-Lo-Sur-Loup. In Russia, the Russes laid the foundation of a nation that endures to this day. Across Ireland and Scotland, Norse influence remains in place names, traditions, and even in the bloodlines of the people. Archaeology continues to reveal their world: the Oseberg ship, the Gokstad burial, silver hoards buried in haste. Each discovery adds new depth reminding us that the Vikings were not only warriors, but artisans, traders, and dreamers. In modern culture, the Vikings have become icons of strength and adventure. From novels and films to television and games, they inspire us with their daring voyages, their fierce courage, and their myths of gods and fate. Yet the true story is richer, a people who farmed as well as fought, who sang as well as slew, who built as much as they burned. The Viking Age was an age of transformation, of Europe, of faith, of identity. Its legacy endures not because of the terror of raids alone, but because the Norse spirit of resilience, curiosity, and courage still speaks to us. When we look to the horizon and dream of what lies beyond, we are not so different from them, from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the shores of England, Francia, Byzantium, and even the distant coasts of North America. The Vikings left a mark that no fire could erase. They were raiders, yes, but also explorers, farmers, poets, traders, and kings. Their sails carried both terror and wonder. Their swords carved both fear and legend. The Viking Age was not only an age of conquest, but of transformation, a time when Europe itself was reshaped by the restless spirit of the North. We have walked beside warriors at Lindisfarne, seers in smoky halls, kings on their thrones, and settlers braving the Atlantic seas. We have seen them at their most brutal and at their most human. And though the age of raids ended, their legacy never did. The languages we speak, the cities we live in, the laws we follow, all still bear the shadow of their presence. The Viking Age may be over, but the spirit that drove them to push beyond every horizon still speaks to us. It is a call to courage, to curiosity, and to resilience. For in every journey into the unknown, the Vikings sail with us still,